For a long moment, no one dared speak, as if sound itself might disturb the unnatural quiet of the room. Amelia clutched at her husband's arm, her breath coming in small, uneven gasps. Charlotte stood very still, her gaze fixed on the fallen solicitor with an expression that hovered somewhere between shock and something more complex. Perhaps fear, perhaps guilt, perhaps only the bewilderment of a young woman suddenly thrust into calamity. Guests crowded the doorway in a hesitant cluster, unwilling to step farther, yet unable to look away. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as a cat in the corner, allowed her eyes to drift gently over the room once more. Her demeanor suggested nothing beyond mild concern, as though she were merely validating that Mr. Lytton truly had no further need of help. But she was noting the angle of the collapsed chair, the indentation on the carpet where another chair had once stood, the faint print of a shoe near the writing desk, half hidden by the corner of the rug. These were details that would escape a hurried observer, but Miss Marple had never hurried in her life. The Colonel rose, grim-faced but steady. "We must call the police at once," he said, though his voice betrayed a tremor he fought to conceal. "No one is to leave the house until they have arrived. This is, well, it is most irregular." Amelia dabbed her eyes with her lace handkerchief. "Irregular, yes, but surely an accident. He might have fainted or slipped." Her voice trailed off, unconvincing even to her own ears. The locked door stood as a stubborn contradiction to her hopeful suggestion. "No accident," Charlotte whispered, almost inaudibly. But Miss Marple heard. She saw, too, the fleeting glance Charlotte cast toward the writing desk before catching herself. The Colonel summoned the butler to telephone Inspector Graves in nearby Merton by King's. The guests, now murmuring in subdued astonishment, were shepherded gently back to the garden by Amelia, who moved as though in a dream. Only Miss Marple, Charlotte, and the Colonel remained in the room while Henry hovered anxiously in the hall. "Miss Marple," the Colonel said when Amelia had gone, "I cannot pretend to understand these sorts of things as you do, but you were nearest the scene after poor Henry here. Did you observe anything unusual?" Miss Marple gave him a placid smile. "Only that locked rooms are very inconvenient things, Colonel. They always suggest more than they initially reveal." Her gaze drifted to the telephone receiver. "It is odd, is it not, that Mr. Lytton should have been speaking to someone at the moment of his misfortune?" Charlotte swallowed hard. "Do you think the person on the line heard something? Oh, if only we knew who he called." "That is for the police to determine," the Colonel said briskly, though he did not hide his unease. "We shall leave everything exactly as it is." When they eventually stepped into the corridor, Charlotte lingered behind. She hesitated, then addressed Miss Marple with a low, urgent tone. I don't know what to think. Mr. Lytton wasn't liked, true, but no one in High Larkspur would do anything so dreadful." Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "My dear, in every village, large or small, there are secrets. Most quite harmless. Some rather less so." She tilted her head slightly. "Had you cause to speak with Mr. Lytton earlier?" Charlotte's eyes widened. "No, well, only briefly. He asked several questions about my late cousin's inheritance. Uncle said it was unnecessary meddling." "I see," Miss Marple said softly. "And did he seem troubled today?" Charlotte hesitated for a fraction too long. "I don't know. I wasn't paying much attention." Miss Marple did not press. People often revealed the truth most clearly when they believed they were concealing it. Outside, the garden party had dissolved into clusters of whispering guests. News traveled faster than breeze through rose petals, and by the time Miss Marple took her seat again, the villagers had formed at least 4 theories, each more imaginative than the last. Some insisted it was a heart attack. Others were certain Mr. Lytton had enemies from his legal work. One elderly farmer muttered darkly about London types bringing trouble wherever they went. Miss Marple listened without appearing to do so. She made no corrections, nor did she encourage speculation, for people in shock often needed the comfort of explanation, however inaccurate. But she observed closely. The reactions of those present told her far more than their words. Who seemed frightened, who seemed inconvenienced, who avoided meeting anyone's gaze, and who seemed almost eager, too eager, to share an opinion. Amelia returned by Miss Marple's table, pale but composed. "The inspector is on his way." "Oh, Miss Marple, how could such a dreadful thing happen here, in our home?" "My dear Amelia," Miss Marple said gently, "dreadful things happen everywhere. One must not assume that lovely surroundings guarantee lovely behavior." The comment made Amelia shiver, though she nodded. As the murmurs around them grew, Miss Marple noticed someone standing apart from the others. Mr. Felix Harrow, the village's reclusive historian. He watched the house with a thoughtful expression, arms crossed tightly as if wrestling with some internal debate. When he saw that Miss Marple observed him, he offered a stiff nod but did not approach. Another small detail to tuck away, and above them, inside the silent blue sitting room, a breeze teased the curtains that had somehow moved despite the locked window latch, an inconsistency Miss Marple intended to revisit at the earliest opportunity. For in her experience, murder, if murder it was, rarely succeeded in hiding its footprints for long. Inspector Graves arrived scarcely half an hour later, his motor car crunching sharply across the gravel drive as the last stray guests were being ushered home. The garden, once lively with chatter and the clink of teacups, now lay abandoned under the late afternoon sun, its silence broken only by the inspector's brisk footsteps as he crossed the lawn. He was a tall man with a narrow face, inquisitive eyes, and a habit of tapping his notebook against his leg when deep in thought. Miss Marple, watching from her seat, thought he seemed competent but inclined toward conclusions formed perhaps a little too hastily. "Colonel Farnwood," he greeted, shaking the colonel's hand. "I understand there's been a situation." The colonel nodded grimly and led him inside. Miss Marple rose quietly and followed at an unobtrusive distance, her expression mild, nearly apologetic, as though she felt she had no right to be near the investigation at all. Yet no one thought to turn her away. When they reached the blue sitting room, Graves halted. "Keep everyone beyond the threshold," he instructed. "I need the scene as untouched as possible." He entered the room alone at first, surveying the overturned chair, the lifeless body, the telephone receiver still lying by Lytton's hand. After a few minutes, he beckoned the colonel to join him. Miss Marple did not intrude, though she lingered close enough to hear the inspector's low voice. "No sign of struggle," Graves observed, "but that bruise on his temple, deliberate force, and you're certain the door was locked from within." The colonel gestured toward the shattered lock. "Henry and I broke it in. The key was still in the inside barrel." Graves crouched by the body. "And the windows?" "Closed. Latch secure," the colonel said. Miss Marple's eyes turned to the windows again. The latch indeed sat neatly in place, untouched since she'd first noticed it, and yet the curtains had moved. A curious matter. Graves rose. Locked room deaths tend to be either tragic accidents or carefully staged illusions. His gaze hardened. "Mr. Lytton didn't strike me as the fainting type. Do we know who he was telephoning?" "No," the colonel replied, "but Charlotte mentioned hearing him say earlier he wanted privacy." "Privacy," the inspector repeated thoughtfully. "For what?" Miss Marple knew from long experience that the answer to such a question was seldom the simplest one. When the inspector turned to her, she offered a polite nod. "I assume, Miss Marple, you were among the first to see the room?" "Oh, yes," she said softly. "Quite unintentionally, of course. Henry called for help, and naturally one must lend what assistance one can." Graves studied her face. Many an officer had underestimated Miss Marple's soft voice and blue eyes. Few did so twice. "Did anything strike you as unusual?" "Well," she murmured, "only that the breeze must be cleverer than I am, for I failed to understand how it slipped into a locked room with the windows quite secured." Graves stared at her a moment, then glanced at the windows, frowning. "You're certain you saw the curtains move?" "I believe so," Miss Marple answered, though in her gentle manner it sounded almost like an apology. "But old eyes can be mistaken. Drafts behave oddly in these old houses." The inspector, not wishing to appear dismissive, wrote a brief note but did not dwell. "We'll know more once the body is examined." As he continued his assessment, Miss Marple stepped back into the hallway. Charlotte stood alone near a small table, hands clasped tightly before her. When she noticed Miss Marple, she forced a thin smile. "The inspector is very serious," she whispered. "Do you think he suspects someone in the house?" "My dear," Miss Marple replied, "he would be remiss not to consider all possibilities. But suspicion is only a beginning, not an end." Charlotte's composure faltered. "I keep thinking, if Mr. Lytton truly was calling someone, that person might know something important." "Quite so. But who could it have been? He hardly knew anyone here." Miss Marple considered this. Newcomers rarely form strong attachments so quickly, unless they have reason to seek information, and Mr. Lytton seemed rather diligent in gathering facts. Charlotte lowered her voice. "He asked me yesterday whether I believed the estate accounts had been properly kept after Cousin Harriet died. Why would he think such a thing?" "Lawyers often entertain concerns others overlook," Miss Marple said gently. "Their profession requires it." Before Charlotte could respond, Inspector Graves stepped from the room. "Miss Vale, I'd like a word." Charlotte stiffened. "With me? But I hardly knew Mr. Lytton." "That may be," Graves replied, "but you were the last person known to have seen him before he went inside. Routine questions, nothing more." He led her to the study, closing the door behind them. Miss Marple, left in the corridor, clasped her hands together. She had no wish to eavesdrop. Indeed, she considered the practice quite improper, but people often spoke loudly during interrogations when anxious, and she could not help hearing snippets. Charlotte insisting she possessed no quarrel with the man, Graves pressing gently about the subject of inheritance, Charlotte denying any impropriety. When at last the door reopened, Charlotte emerged visibly shaken. The inspector soon followed, his expression thoughtful. Miss Marple approached him. "Is everything quite all right?" "For now," he replied curtly, though without rudeness. "But Miss Vale is withholding something. I can sense it." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "Young women sometimes hold back out of fear rather than guilt." "Fear of what?" "That," she said, "is the question worth asking." And as she watched Charlotte retreat upstairs, Miss Marple suspected the answer would lead them deeper into the very secrets High Larkspur wished to keep hidden. The evening light had softened into a warm amber glow by the time Inspector Graves finished questioning the household staff, yet it brought no comfort to the uneasy atmosphere lingering over Larkspur Hall. Footsteps echoed along the corridor with unusual sharpness, each person moving with the cautious quiet of those who feared disturbing something fragile and hidden. Miss Marple, having retired briefly to her guest room to collect her thoughts, now descended the staircase with deliberate calm. She never hurried. Haste clouded perception, and perception, especially now, must remain unobscured. In the drawing-room, the Colonel stood by the fireplace, staring into its unlit grate as though answers might lie between the iron bars. Amelia sat nearby in a floral armchair, twisting her handkerchief until it resembled a frayed rope. They looked up when Miss Marple entered. "My dear Miss Marple," Amelia murmured, "the inspector has been questioning everyone. I do hope it's not putting undue strain on you." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, no strain at all. The inspector is quite right to be thorough." The Colonel exhaled sharply. "It's an unpleasant business, but necessary. A locked room, an injury suggestive of violence, it all points to foul play, and if that's the case, the villain must be someone who was here today." Amelia flinched at the word villain. Miss Marple observed her reaction closely. The lady of the house possessed a delicate constitution where scandal was concerned. "I suppose," Amelia whispered, "that terrible things can happen anywhere, but I can hardly believe that anyone present could have wished Mr. Lytton harm." The colonel frowned. He wasn't universally liked, Amelia. The man had a talent for prying. Yes, she admitted reluctantly. He did ask rather peculiar questions. Miss Marple took a seat beside her. Might I ask what sort of questions, dear? Oh, Amelia said, wringing the handkerchief anew, mostly concerning the estate. Nothing truly alarming, though I confess I found it odd he was so invested in matters that hardly concerned him. This matched what Charlotte had said, and what Charlotte had not said. Miss Marple filed the thought away. Before more could be discussed, Inspector Graves entered the drawing-room, his notebook tucked under one arm. He paused upon seeing Miss Marple, then nodded respectfully, though his expression remained preoccupied. "Colonel, Mrs. Farnwood, may I have a word?" "Certainly," the colonel replied. "What have you discovered?" "Very little that clarifies matters," Graves admitted. "The staff offer no indication of suspicious activity. None were near the East Wing during the time Mr. Lytton entered the blue sitting room. According to every account, he was entirely alone." "And the telephone?" Miss Marple asked delicately. "Dead end for the moment," the inspector said. "The line was open when we checked, but the exchange couldn't confirm who he was speaking with. The call appears to have been routed through an external operator, and the logs will take time to sort." Miss Marple nodded. "People often attempt complicated things with telephones," she said quietly. "But the real complication is usually in the motive rather than the machinery." Graves gave her a brief, almost reluctant smile. "Quite." He turned back to the colonel. "I shall need to question Miss Vale again. She is evasive, though polite. Something weighs heavily on her." The colonel stiffened. "Surely you don't believe Charlotte had anything to do with—" "I believe," Graves interrupted mildly, "that she is withholding information, and that, Colonel, can be as obstructive to an inquiry as deliberate deceit." Miss Marple noticed Amelia's hands tighten. "But Charlotte is such a dear girl," she protested. "She wouldn't keep secrets unless she felt she must," Miss Marple finished gently. Amelia's eyes widened slightly, though she said no more. Inspector Graves straightened. "I'd like to speak with Lytton's landlady next, Mrs. Pennington, I believe. If he kept notes or correspondence at his lodgings, it may shed light on his activities." The colonel agreed to telegraph for her, and Graves departed to draft the necessary message. Amelia excused herself to see to the household, leaving Miss Marple alone with the colonel. He rubbed his forehead. "Miss Marple, forgive my frankness, but I feel as though something is slipping through my fingers. I cannot bear the notion that murder may have occurred under my roof." Miss Marple gazed at him with sympathetic clarity. "Colonel, homes are merely walls and windows. They do not choose their events. People do, and understanding people always begins with understanding what they fear losing most." The colonel looked at her sharply, but before he could inquire further, footsteps approached. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, pale but determined. "Uncle," she said softly, "may I speak with you? And Miss Marple, if she doesn't mind." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Not at all, my dear." Charlotte entered, closing the door behind her. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I didn't tell the inspector everything, not because I wished to deceive him, but because I was afraid it would sound worse than it is." The colonel bristled. "Charlotte, what could you possibly—" She cut him off with a pleading glance. "Please, I only want to explain." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Begin wherever you feel you should." Charlotte swallowed. "Mr. Lytton visited me yesterday, privately. He said he'd found something troubling in Aunt Harriet's financial records, something that could change the inheritance." Miss Marple felt the faintest stir of confirmation. She had suspected as much. "And," Charlotte continued, voice shaking, "he asked me whether I had noticed any irregular transfers. I said no, but he didn't seem convinced." The colonel's eyes widened with both alarm and indignation. "What sort of accusation is that? Harriet's accounts were handled properly." Charlotte nodded miserably. I believed so too, but Mr. Lytton hinted that someone in the family might have benefited improperly. Silence filled the room, tense as a held breath. Miss Marple leaned forward very slightly, her voice soft but precise. My dear, did he tell you whom he suspected? Charlotte hesitated, and Miss Marple saw with absolute clarity that the answer, whatever it was, would alter the course of the entire investigation. Charlotte's lips parted, but no sound came at first. She looked from her uncle to Miss Marple, her eyes clouded with the torment of someone caught between loyalty and fear. When she finally spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper. He didn't name anyone directly, but he implied, strongly, that the irregularities pointed towards someone inside this house, someone with access to Aunt Harriet's accounts after her passing. The colonel stiffened, a flush rising up his neck. That's preposterous. Harriet's affairs were overseen by a professional accountant, and I reviewed every document myself. If Lytton believed otherwise, he was mistaken or deliberately making trouble. Miss Marple observed the colonel's indignation with quiet attention. People often protested too quickly when their certainty felt threatened. But she said nothing. She merely watched Charlotte, who was twisting the hem of her sleeve with trembling fingers. He asked me, Charlotte continued, whether I'd noticed any change in Uncle's behavior after Aunt Harriet's death. She cast a helpless glance toward the colonel. I told him no, of course. I thought he was speaking nonsense. The colonel's eyes widened in surprise rather than outrage. Me? Of all people. Why on earth would he? Miss Marple interjected gently, not necessarily accusing Colonel, merely probing. Her tone was mild, almost soothing. Lawyers do that, test reactions like a doctor tapping a patient's knee. Charlotte swallowed. He said he had documents. Proof, he called it. But he wouldn't show me. He said he needed time to confirm everything. And now he's dead, the colonel said darkly, pacing toward the window. Convenient, isn't it, if someone feared what he might reveal? Charlotte shuddered. You don't think anyone here would... No, the colonel said firmly, though his voice carried more force than conviction. No one in this family would harm a man over money. Miss Marple, very still in her chair, folded her hands over one another. Money has caused many a quarrel in villages, she said softly, and quite a few tragedies as well. But it is not only money that breeds danger. Secrets, too, have sharp edges. Charlotte met her gaze as though silently pleading for reassurance, but Miss Marple offered none. She had seen too many households cloaked in polite decorum that hid cracks beneath the veneer. And the documents Mr. Lytton mentioned, she added thoughtfully. Did he say where he kept them? No, Charlotte said. He was very guarded. I think he mistrusted everyone. As well he might, the colonel muttered. A firm knocking interrupted them. Inspector Graves entered without waiting for invitation, his expression sharpened by new information. I've spoken briefly with Mrs. Pennington, he announced. She sent word that Mr. Lytton received several letters this past week, most from London. One arrived yesterday afternoon, and Mrs. Pennington said he seemed quite agitated when he read it. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained mild. Did she mention if he replied to any of them? Graves shook his head. She said he wrote something quickly after reading the last letter and left the house in a hurry. She assumed it was urgent business. It must have been, Miss Marple murmured, if he came to speak with Charlotte at once. The inspector turned sharply. Miss Vale, you told me earlier that your conversation with the deceased concerned inheritance matters. Care to elaborate? Charlotte flushed. I didn't think the details were important. But Mr. Lytton said he had found something suspicious. He asked about my cousin Harriet's accounts, and he said, someone may have been diverting funds. The inspector's brows shot upward. And you withheld this because... I was frightened, Charlotte said, voice cracking. I didn't want to accuse anyone without proof. Miss Marple moved slightly, a quiet shift in her seat. Dear child, she said kindly. Not speaking of something does not undo it. Silence merely invites confusion. Graves took a steadying breath. Miss Vale, what you've told me changes the entire course of this investigation. If Lytton had evidence someone wished to conceal, that person may well have had motive to kill him. Charlotte's face paled. But there's no proof yet. Perhaps not, Graves answered. But we must consider every possibility. The colonel bristled. Inspector, I trust you're not implying that anyone here. I'm implying nothing, Graves said curtly. I follow the facts, and right now the facts are very peculiar. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Inspector, if I may, it seems to me the most urgent matter is to discover what became of Mr. Lytton's papers. If he indeed possessed documents of great significance, we must determine whether they were taken from him, before or after his death. Graves nodded slowly. I intend to search his lodgings tonight. Mrs. Pennington has agreed to let me in. Excellent, Miss Marple said. Though I wonder... Graves turned. Yes? I wonder, she repeated gently, whether his papers might not have been brought here today. If he intended to speak with Charlotte further, or someone else, he may have wished to have them close at hand. A silence followed, heavy and meaningful. The colonel's brows knitted. Are you suggesting Lytton had those documents with him when he died? Miss Marple lifted her gaze toward the ceiling as though contemplating nothing more serious than where one might find a misplaced glove. It would be sensible, would it not? A man convinced he holds dangerous information would be unlikely to leave it unattended. Charlotte's voice trembled. Then where are they? Miss Marple looked toward the corridor, the direction of the blue sitting room. That, my dear, she said softly, is what we must discover. And quickly, for if those papers have vanished, then someone here has already retrieved them. And in her experience, the person who retrieved such papers rarely did so harmlessly. The corridor outside the drawing room felt colder than before, as though the walls themselves absorbed the weight of suspicion now hanging over Larkspur Hall. Miss Marple stepped into it with quiet purpose, her gaze drifting toward the east wing. She had no intention of disturbing the blue sitting room again without cause, but the notion that Mr. Lytton's mysterious documents might have been within those walls and removed by unseen hands pressed itself upon her mind with increasing insistence. Inspector Graves followed her out, closing the drawing-room door behind him. Miss Marple, he said, lowering his voice, you believe someone retrieved something from the body? I believe, she replied gently, that when someone goes to great lengths to keep information hidden, they rarely stop at one wrongdoing. If Mr. Lytton carried sensitive documents, it is sensible to assume they would have attracted immediate interest. Graves tapped his notebook against his palm. I intend to search the room again, methodically. If anything was hidden, overlooked, or spirited away, we must find a trace. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, though one must never assume such things leave physical traces. People can be very clever about concealing their intentions. He eyed her. And their guilt? And that too, she said, with a faint smile that betrayed nothing. They walked together toward the blue sitting room, where the door hung awkwardly from its broken latch. The room was dimmer now, the curtains no longer billowing but settling in, still folds against the window. The faint smell she had noticed earlier, something sharp, unfamiliar, lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. Miss Marple stepped aside as Graves entered with professional caution. He crouched near the writing desk first, examining drawers and compartments with care. No signs of rifling, he murmured. Either the killer found what they sought quickly, or nothing was hidden here. Miss Marple wandered near the window. Curious, she said softly. Graves straightened. What is? The latch, she explained. Still firmly closed, and yet the curtains were moving earlier. Draught from the broken door, perhaps. Perhaps, she acknowledged, though uncertainty gently colored her tone. The inspector retrieved the telephone receiver from the floor. "If only we knew whom he was calling," he muttered. "Someone must have heard something." Miss Marple studied the cord. "Inspector, might he have been expecting someone? People often make telephone calls when afraid, seeking reassurance rather than conversation." Graves made a note of that. "I'll ask the exchange again. Someone must have connected that call." He searched the rest of the room. Beneath the sofa cushions, behind the small sideboard, even under the carpet edges. Miss Marple watched silently, her eyes drifting to the small indentation in the carpet where once another chair had stood. It was still there, subtle but certainly present. "Inspector," she said quietly, "there was another chair here earlier, a matching one." Graves swung around. "You're sure?" "Oh, yes," she replied, her voice mild. "The carpet shows it plainly." He examined the spot, running a hand over the fibers. "Someone moved it," he said slowly. "But why?" Miss Marple offered no answer. She seldom gave answers before she was ready. When it became clear that nothing else in the room offered fresh clues, Graves left to continue his rounds. Miss Marple lingered a few extra moments, letting her gaze travel across the space with her customary gentleness. Everything in the room looked perfectly ordinary, yet the ordinary often held secrets if one knew where to look. She pressed lightly on the window frame, tested the latch, then leaned just slightly outward. A few strands of torn cobweb clung to the outside corner of the sill, fluttering faintly. That was enough for now. As she stepped back into the hallway, she nearly collided with Mr. Felix Harrow, the village historian whose earlier standoffishness had not escaped her notice. He stood rigidly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes flicking toward the open sitting-room door. "Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple greeted pleasantly. "You appear troubled." His eyes darted to her, sharp and wary. "Accidents in locked rooms tend to trouble people." "Indeed they do," she replied, "though I'm not convinced this was an accident." He gave an odd, stiff smile. "Nor am I, Miss Marple. Mr. Lytton was far too self-important to simply fall over his own feet. That is one way of viewing it." Felix hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. "Tell me, did he say anything before he died? Anything at all?" Miss Marple studied him with the benign patience of a grandmother observing a child about to fib. "He was quite silent when we found him." Felix nodded slowly, but in his eyes something flickered. Relief? Worry? It was difficult to tell with him. "Why do you ask, Mr. Harrow?" "Curiosity," he said quickly. "Only that. After all, the man was asking questions yesterday no one appreciated." "Were they about the estate?" she asked lightly. He blinked too rapidly. "Estate? No, local history, that's all." And before she could reply, he turned on his heel and strode away with unnecessary haste. Miss Marple watched him vanish down the corridor. "Local history," she murmured. "How very interesting." She made her way toward the staircase. On the landing above, Charlotte appeared again, clutching a small book. When she noticed Miss Marple approaching, she hesitated as though wrestling between retreat and confession. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "may I speak with you privately?" "Of course, my dear." Charlotte descended the steps and stopped at the midpoint, lowering her voice further. "I remembered something else. Something I didn't tell the inspector." Miss Marple's expression softened, her eyes attentive. "Go on." "It's about the documents Mr. Lytton mentioned. He said he had a witness, someone who could confirm everything, someone close by." Miss Marple felt the faintest tightening in her chest, a quiet ripple, nothing more. "And did he name this witness?" Charlotte shook her head. "No, but he meant to meet them today, here, during the garden party." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then the witness must have been present." "Yes," Charlotte whispered, fear coloring her voice. "And that means the witness may also be in danger." Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on her arm. "My dear," she said calmly, "I rather think the danger has already begun." Charlotte's whispered confession lingered in the air long after Miss Marple gently squeezed her hand and assured her that she had done the right thing. They stood together a moment longer on the staircase, listening to the muted shuffling of constables moving through the hall and the distant murmur of Inspector Graves issuing instructions. The house felt strangely hollow now, every sound amplified and tinged with unease. Miss Marple urged the young woman softly. "It is best you return to the others, dear. The inspector may wish to speak with you again shortly, and it will do no good for you to appear as though you're withholding anything." Charlotte nodded, though her expression remained troubled. She slipped back toward the drawing room, leaving Miss Marple alone on the landing. The elderly woman paused, resting one hand lightly on the polished banister. A witness. Someone Mr. Lytton trusted enough to meet at the very gathering intended to ease social tensions. Someone he believed could confirm whatever unpleasant truth he had uncovered. Her eyes drifted upward toward the second-floor corridor. She had no desire to intrude further into private rooms without invitation, yet she sensed something important remained hidden, not on the ground floor but above. People often underestimated the significance of upper hallways and little-used bedrooms. Secrets frequently gravitated toward overlooked places. She ascended the remaining steps with slow, deliberate care. At the top, a long runner carpet stretched in muted blue and cream, muffling her steps. Doors lined the passage, each closed, each quietly guarding its own story. Miss Marple's gaze paused on the one nearest the staircase. A small brass plaque indicated it belonged to Mr. Lytton during his stay. She hesitated only briefly before knocking, out of politeness rather than expectation. Receiving no answer, she turned the knob. The door gave way with a faint click. The room was modestly furnished, a guest chamber like any other in Larkspur Hall. Neat bed, small writing desk, wardrobe, and a single suitcase open atop a stand. Miss Marple stepped inside, letting her eyes sweep the room once before approaching the desk. A notebook lay there, its first few pages blank but lightly smudged as though someone had turned them with hurried fingers. She leafed through, finding only a few cryptic lines written in a neat but tense script. "Confirmed tomorrow. Witness certain. If true, must act immediately. Danger greater than I thought." There was no signature, though it was clearly Mr. Lytton's hand. Miss Marple closed the notebook with a soft sigh. Whatever he had planned, he had not lived to carry it out. Yet he had believed his witness trustworthy. Who in the village inspired such confidence, and who would inspire such fear? A faint creak sounded from the hallway. Miss Marple turned just in time to see the door shift. Felix Harrow stood at the threshold, his posture unusually rigid, as though caught in a trespass. "I didn't realize anyone was up here," he said, his tone too casual to be convincing. Miss Marple offered a warm smile. "I was just having a little look around. These rooms can tell one quite a bit about their occupants." Felix's eyes flicked to the notebook on the desk. "You shouldn't handle his things. The inspector won't approve." "Quite right," she said lightly, "though he is very busy at the moment, and sometimes small details are best noticed before they can be removed or tidied away." His jaw tightened. "You're implying something." "I am merely observing." Her tone remained pleasantly mild. "One learns a great deal from watching how people respond to surprises." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Felix stepped back into the hallway, the tension in his shoulders betraying more than he intended. "If you're determined to meddle," he said, "do be careful, Miss Marple. You never know what you might stir up." She let him go without reply, listening to his retreating footsteps fade into the lower floor. When the corridor was silent once more, she left the guest room and closed the door gently behind her. She knew better than to confront a man like Felix directly. Subtlety always worked better, especially with those who prided themselves on their intellectual superiority. As she moved back downstairs, the faint clatter of teacups reached her. Mrs. Farnaby's voice rang out in a blend of irritation and fear. "Well, I don't see why we should all be kept here like prisoners. It's preposterous, and I for one won't stand for it." Miss Marple drifted toward the drawing-room doorway, where a few guests had gathered again in uneasy clusters. Mrs. Farnaby continued to huff, and beside her, Mrs. Blackshaw nodded vigorously, though her eyes darted about with nervous energy. Florence Alden attempted to soothe them. "Inspector Graves is only being thorough. We must give him time." Mrs. Blackshaw leaned close to Florence. "But do you think it's true that Mr. Lytton had enemies here, in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple settled into a chair near the hearth. "My dear Mrs. Blackshaw, you know as well as I do that villagers are not immune to secrets. Quite the contrary." A hush fell briefly over the room at that. Florence glanced at Miss Marple with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. "Do you really believe the killer is among us?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I believe the truth tends to remain close to where the trouble began." Before anyone could press her further, Inspector Graves entered briskly. His expression was grim. "I need to speak with you all," he announced. "Another development has come to light." Miss Marple felt the room hold its breath. Whatever revelation he was about to deliver would, she sensed, shift everything once more. And perhaps, just perhaps, bring them one step closer to identifying the elusive witness before the killer reached them first. Inspector Graves stood near the center of the drawing-room, his expression taut and unreadable, though the stiffness of his shoulders suggested frustration rather than progress. The guests gradually fell into silence, the last whispers dying like embers in a hearth. Miss Marple, sitting serenely with her hands folded over her handbag, watched him with mild attentiveness. "Another discovery has been made," Graves announced, eyes scanning the room. "We found Mr. Lytton's wristwatch in the shrubbery beneath the blue sitting-room window." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Mrs. Farnaby gasped, clutching her pearls with dramatic flair. Mrs. Blackshaw, looking genuinely unsettled, whispered to Florence, "But how could it end up there? That room was locked." Florence shook her head. "Unless someone left by the window or entered through it." Inspector Graves raised a hand to still the chatter. "The window was latched from the inside, and yet the watch appears to have been thrown, or dropped, from that very direction." Miss Marple's head tilted ever so slightly. She had noticed the cobwebs outside the sill earlier. If someone had climbed through, surely they would have disturbed them more than the faint tear she had observed. But people did curious things when panicked. Graves continued. "What's more, the watch stopped at precisely 3:42. Our estimation places Mr. Lytton's time of death close to that. We're looking into the significance." Felix Harrow, who had taken up a position near the far wall, interjected. "It could have fallen during a struggle." Graves acknowledged him with a curt nod. "Possibly, or it may have been removed intentionally. Regardless, it broadens our understanding of the sequence of events." Miss Marple studied Felix discreetly. His voice was steady, but his eyes were a shade too alert, too calculated, as if he were measuring the inspector's words for hidden meaning. Before anyone could pose another question, Charlotte slipped into the drawing-room, pale but composed. She looked relieved to see Miss Marple and took a seat close by, unable to quell her anxious glances. Graves cleared his throat. "We will continue examining the grounds. For now, I must ask you all to remain available. None of you may leave Larkspur Hall." Mrs. Farnaby let out an indignant puff of air. "Really, Inspector, you act as though we might be involved." "Until proven otherwise," Graves said sharply. "Anyone could be." He exited with 2 constables in tow, leaving a vacuum of tension behind him. Conversations erupted again, louder this time, like steam bursting from a kettle. Charlotte leaned toward Miss Marple. "Does this complicate things?" "Everything complicates things, my dear," Miss Marple replied with a soft smile. "Human beings rarely act simply. Still, the watch is interesting. It suggests haste or fear, or both. Felix approached them, his smile stretched too thin. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope you're not drawing any conclusions. This whole business has the inspector chasing shadows." "Oh, I never chase shadows," she said pleasantly. "I find it far more effective to watch where other people's shadows fall." Felix blinked, caught off guard, then forced a laugh. "Very philosophical." "Not at all," she replied. "Simply practical." He excused himself soon after, retreating into the hallway. Charlotte watched him go, then turned to Miss Marple, voice trembling slightly. "Do you think he knows more than he's admitting?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. People often reveal more in their silences than in their words. Charlotte frowned. "Meaning?" "It means, my dear, that Mr. Harrow is a man accustomed to controlling information. When such people appear nervous, one should always wonder why." Charlotte seemed to process this, her breath unsteady. "I wish Mr. Lytton had told me more. I wish I knew who the witness was." Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "Perhaps you know more than you realize." Before Charlotte could ask what she meant, Florence Alden approached them with a troubled expression. "Miss Marple, might I have a word?" Charlotte rose to give them space, and Florence sank into the seat beside the elderly woman, clasping her hands tightly. "I didn't say this earlier," Florence began, "but Mr. Lytton spoke to me last night. Only briefly, you understand? But he asked peculiar questions." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "What sort of questions?" "He wanted to know about the estate's older records, land transfers, that sort of thing. I told him I knew very little, but he seemed disappointed, as though he expected me to confirm something." "Did he mention a name?" Miss Marple asked. Florence bit her lip. "Yes, just one. He asked if I had ever heard of a man called Arthur Penrose." Miss Marple stilled. Penrose. It was a name not spoken in the village for many years, a name tied to a minor scandal long buried under polite silence. A dispute over property lines, whispered accusations of forgery, and a sudden disappearance. Nothing ever proven, yet never forgotten by older villagers. "And did you tell him anything?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Only that Penrose vanished decades ago and no one knew what happened to him. Mr. Lytton seemed intrigued. He said the past had a way of returning." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the hallway where Felix had disappeared. The past, indeed. Mr. Harrow's family had been entangled in the Penrose affair, though Felix rarely acknowledged it. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "This is very helpful." Florence exhaled shakily. "Do you think the murder has something to do with Mr. Penrose?" "It has something to do with someone," Miss Marple replied. "And with something they very much wish to keep hidden." A sudden cry rang out from the hall. Miss Marple rose at once, her heart steady but alert. The danger, she thought, had just taken another step forward. The cry from the hallway sliced through the drawing-room chatter, freezing every conversation mid-sentence. Miss Marple was already halfway to the door before most guests could rise from their seats. Her steps were steady, though her pulse quickened. Cries of that nature rarely came without consequence. Inspector Graves arrived at nearly the same moment, striding from the opposite corridor. A uniformed constable waved them over urgently. "Sir, in here." Miss Marple followed them toward a small alcove near the side entrance of the house, a seldom-used part of Larkspur Hall where umbrellas and coats were typically stored. As they approached, she spotted Mrs. Blackshaw collapsed against the wall, trembling violently, one gloved hand pressed to her mouth. I didn't mean to scream," she managed, her voice shaking, "but I opened the cupboard and, oh dear God." Graves brushed past her and yanked open the narrow cupboard door. Inside, slumped awkwardly among a cluster of umbrellas and walking sticks, was a man's coat. "No," Miss Marple corrected silently as she leaned closer. It was not merely a coat. A body lay partly concealed beneath it. The inspector bent down at once. "Who is this?" he muttered, pulling aside the heavy fabric. Miss Marple recognized him even before Graves did. "Mr. Brent," she said quietly. "The gardener." Indeed, there he was. Mr. Thomas Brent, a stooped but capable man who had tended the grounds of Larkspur Hall for years. His eyes were open but unseeing, his expression contorted in what might have been fear or pain. A faint bruise marred his temple. Mrs. Blackshaw let out another strangled sob. "I only wanted my coat. Why would he be in there? Why would anyone—" "Constable," Graves said sharply. "Clear the area. No one else is to approach." Miss Marple stepped aside, allowing the inspector room to examine the body. Though she remained outwardly calm, a knot tightened in her chest. A second death, so soon, so abruptly, was no coincidence, and Mr. Brent had no known quarrel with Mr. Lytton. But he had been working on the estate grounds for years. He would have known the land, the buildings, the concealed pathways and forgotten corners better than anyone. And he may have known something he shouldn't. Inspector Graves checked the man's pockets, then the angle of his head. "No immediate sign of a struggle," he murmured. "Could be a fall. But the bruise? He wasn't there earlier," Miss Marple said softly. "We passed this alcove twice. No one noticed any disturbance." Graves nodded grimly. "Meaning someone placed him here?" "Recently." "But why hide him?" Miss Marple asked. "To delay discovery," the inspector replied, "or to make it seem accidental. Perhaps both." Mrs. Blackshaw was led away by Florence Alden, who whispered reassurances as the shaken woman clung to her arm. Miss Marple watched them go, then turned her attention back to the alcove. There, on the floor near Mr. Brent's boot, lay something small and metallic, half hidden by shadow. "Inspector," she called gently. Graves followed her gaze. He knelt and retrieved the object. It was a single cufflink, silver, engraved with a stylized letter, H. Felix Harrow. The inspector's jaw tightened. I knew he was involved more deeply than he claimed. Miss Marple placed a light hand on his arm. "Let us not jump to conclusions. People drop things, Inspector, and determined individuals can make such drops appear intentional. You think someone planted it?" "I think," she replied carefully, "that we should consider all possibilities." Graves pocketed the cufflink nonetheless. "Mr. Harrow will answer several questions. Immediately." As he strode off, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, observing the alcove. The umbrellas hung neatly, none out of place except one with a slightly bent tip. A faint scuff mark marred the inside wall as though someone had shoved the body in hurriedly. Miss Marple examined the umbrella tip. A speck of something dark clung to it. Mud? Or something else? She decided not to touch it yet. The inspector would circle back soon enough. Charlotte appeared in the hall, her face pale. "Miss Marple, what's happened?" Mrs. Blackshaw looked as though she'd seen a ghost. "I'm afraid, my dear, that it was something far worse," Miss Marple answered gently. "Mr. Brent has been found. He's dead." Charlotte's hand flew to her lips. Oh no, not him. He was so kind, always helping with the flower beds. Yes, a quiet man, and such men often notice more than others expect. Charlotte swallowed hard. "Do you think he was the witness?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. He may have seen something, or he may have known about older matters. "Like Mr. Penrose," Charlotte whispered. "Possibly." Just then, raised voices echoed from the far corridor. Felix Harrow's voice rose sharply above the others. "I have done nothing wrong. That cufflink could have been stolen, planted, anything." Inspector Graves snapped something back, but the words were lost in the commotion. Miss Marple moved slowly down the hallway, Charlotte trailing behind her. As they approached the confrontation, Graves appeared ready to arrest Felix on the spot. Felix, red-faced and furious, pointed wildly at the inspector. "This is absurd. You're desperate to blame someone, and I am a convenient target." That cufflink speaks for itself, Graves retorted. Miss Marple stepped calmly between them. Gentlemen, she said with quiet authority, if I may, there is something you both ought to consider. They turned toward her. The cufflink, she continued, is quite polished, remarkably so. Yet the alcove is dusty, and Mr. Brent's clothing showed no signs of having been recently handled, which suggests the cufflink did not fall there today. Graves frowned. Meaning? Meaning, Miss Marple said gently. The person who placed Mr. Brent in that cupboard may have also placed the cufflink, and if so, the true killer wishes very much for us to look in the wrong direction. The hallway fell silent, and Miss Marple felt, unmistakably, that the killer was somewhere nearby. Listening, the hallway seemed to shrink under the weight of Miss Marple's words. Guests pressed back against the walls, their eyes flicking nervously between her, Inspector Graves, and Felix Harrow, who now appeared more controlled yet equally defiant. The elderly detective's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. Yet those watching her felt a subtle authority in every measured gesture, every faintly arched eyebrow. Graves spoke, voice tight with impatience. Miss Marple, you think someone planted evidence? Then why lead me to Harrow at all? Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Because, Inspector, some people are clever enough to foresee that others will do the work for them. One places a small, obvious item and waits to see who reacts first. Felix's face hardened. So you are insinuating I'm a fool? Not at all, Miss Marple said softly. But a clever fool often makes the most noticeable mistakes. Watch and see. She allowed the words to hang, like mist over the hall. Charlotte, still standing a little behind her, whispered, Do you really think he did it? Could Felix have killed them both? Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, or perhaps he fears someone else as much as we do. The question is, who benefits from these deaths and these distractions? Graves, who had been scribbling in his notebook, lifted his eyes. So, Miss Marple, where do we go from here? We have the cufflink, we have a dead gardener, and the first victim was, well, Mr. Lytton, who uncovered something dangerous. What now? Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the blue sitting room, almost as though she could see the very atmosphere of the space. Now, we observe. There is something in this house, Inspector, that one person wishes desperately to keep hidden. The others are unwitting or perhaps merely cautious. She turned slightly, studying each guest present. And people, when nervous, tend to reveal more than they intend. Graves' eyes narrowed. So, we wait for mistakes? Yes, she said, and I believe one will occur soon. Just then, a low sound came from the far end of the corridor, a soft, metallic clink. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Every ear in the hallway seemed to register the noise. Someone had dropped something. Felix flinched slightly, a micro-expression almost lost in the general tension. Miss Marple noticed immediately. She moved her hand subtly toward her handbag, pretending to adjust it, and let her gaze travel casually toward the study door across the hall. Charlotte whispered, What was that? Patience, my dear, Miss Marple said quietly. We are about to see whether nerves or guilt will betray what has been carefully concealed. Graves pivoted toward the direction of the sound, frowning. I'll check it out, he said, and started down the corridor. Miss Marple, however, held him back with a finger lightly placed on his arm. Wait, she said. Do not move too quickly. Let the person think the noise went unnoticed. Watch their reactions. Felix, meanwhile, was adjusting his cuff, a subtle but deliberate motion. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him. The slight tremor in his hand suggested anxiety, but it was not fear of discovery, it was fear of misjudgment. He feared the wrong interpretation of his movements. Clever people are often trapped by such self-consciousness. Charlotte's whisper cut through the tension. Do you mean... He's trying to cover something, but he might slip. Yes, exactly, Miss Marple murmured. Observe carefully. His next actions will speak louder than words. Felix's gaze darted briefly toward the alcove where Mr. Brent had been discovered. A momentary shadow passed over his expression, almost imperceptible, but for trained observation, unmistakable. He exhaled sharply, though he attempted to make it seem like nothing more than impatience at the delay. Miss Marple noted it all quietly, her mind cataloguing each reaction, each shift of weight, each flicker of the eyes. The culprit often underestimates the subtle power of human observation, especially from someone who appears distracted or uninterested. Graves returned, frowning. "Nothing, Miss Marple. No one was there. The noise must have been incidental." "Perhaps," she said softly, "or perhaps a message for those watching." She allowed the silence to stretch a moment as if letting the suggestion sink in. Felix shifted his stance again, glancing nervously at Charlotte and then toward the sitting room. Miss Marple's gaze followed, noting the faint scuff mark on the hallway carpet near the study door. It was small, easily missed, but enough to suggest movement, deliberate, cautious, yet hurried. "Inspector," she said finally, "I believe the next clue, or the next misstep, will come not from evidence, but from observation. Someone is very concerned with appearances. Their caution will betray them if we watch closely enough." Charlotte's eyes widened. "Do you think it will happen tonight?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. "I suspect it will, my dear. People who act in haste or fear rarely consider the quiet, patient observer. And patience," she added, "is a weapon more precise than any other." The hallway remained still, though charged with expectancy. Felix Harrow's subtle shifts, the echoing footfalls, the faint creak of the floorboards, they all conspired to create a tension that hung like a tangible thread over Larkspur Hall. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing, lips pressed together in thought. Somewhere in this house, the truth waited. And soon, someone would make the mistake that revealed it. The danger was close, the stakes were high, and the next revelation, she knew, would change everything. The first misstep, she reflected quietly, would be the key, and she would see it, understand it, and follow it, until the true culprit could no longer hide. Miss Marple stood quietly in the drawing-room, observing the uneasy assembly of Larkspur Hall's residents. The tension in the air was palpable, like the static before a storm. Inspector Graves had gathered them together at her suggestion, though he seemed uncertain about the wisdom of letting the elderly lady take the lead. Miss Marple, however, was entirely composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze calm and penetrating. She had watched, noted, and waited, and now the moment had come to act. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice soft, yet carrying with unshakable authority, "the events of this afternoon and evening have been most unfortunate. 2 deaths, a stolen or hidden set of documents, and an air of secrecy that weighs heavily upon this house. Yet I believe that we may resolve these mysteries with careful attention and reason." A nervous rustle swept through the room. Felix Harrow shifted, his expression guarded. Charlotte clutched her hands together as though bracing herself. Even the Colonel's rigid posture betrayed the uncertainty he felt. "First," Miss Marple continued, "we must consider Mr. Lytton's behavior before his death. He believed he had uncovered irregularities in the estate's accounts. He spoke to Charlotte about these suspicions, and he mentioned a witness, a person whose testimony he trusted to confirm certain facts." She paused briefly, letting the words sink in. Yet he did not live to see the matter resolved. His documents disappeared, and someone, it seems, wished them to remain unseen. Graves leaned forward. "You mean the killer stole the papers?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said gently, "or they may have been hidden to create confusion. It is not always the act of stealing that conceals truth. Sometimes simply moving an item is enough to mislead observers." Her gaze turned to Felix. Mr. Harrow, we observed your reactions throughout the evening. Subtle, yes, but revealing. The first misstep was when you flinched upon hearing the metallic sound in the corridor. An ordinary noise, yet you treated it as significant. That hesitation suggested that you were aware of something that others were not. Felix's jaw tightened. "Miss Marple, Please do not interrupt," she said softly. "Observe the pattern. The cufflink found near Mr. Brent's body bore your initials. You were careful to polish it, I suspect, before planting it. You intended for the inspector to follow an obvious line of suspicion, believing that the real trace of the crime would remain unnoticed." Harrow's eyes widened, and a faint tremor betrayed more than words could. "That is absurd," he protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Perhaps it seemed so at first. But then we consider Mr. Brent, found in the alcove. A quiet man, reliable, and capable of observing more than most. He must have seen something, or even handled the documents momentarily. That made him a liability." Charlotte gasped softly. "He was killed because he knew something," she whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And Mr. Lytton's death was the catalyst, for he pressed too close to matters others wished hidden. The pattern is clear. The deaths, the concealment, the distractions, they all point to one individual seeking control over information." Felix's composure cracked, and his hands clenched into fists. "You have no proof," he snapped. "No evidence." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unyielding. Proof is often not required when one observes carefully. Mr. Harrow, you feared discovery, yet you were meticulous in your movements and yet impatient in small, telling ways. The alcove scuff mark, the dropped metallic object, the subtle glance toward the blue sitting room, each was recorded in your behavior. It is by behavior, not by force or forensic analysis, that one's intentions are most clearly revealed. The room was silent, every ear straining, every eye fixed on the subtle drama unfolding. The inspector's notebook lay forgotten for the moment. Even he seemed to recognize the precision of Miss Marple's deductions. Felix's face paled, and he glanced toward the hallway, then back at her. "Fine," he said finally, voice low and defeated. "Yes, I planted the cufflink, but it was only to mislead you. I did not harm Mr. Brent. That was an accident. He fell when I pushed him toward the alcove. He was unsteady, I swear." Graves stepped forward immediately, but Miss Marple held up a hand. "Inspector, let him speak. Accuracy in confession comes more easily when one feels the observer understands the full sequence of events." Felix took a deep breath. "I discovered the documents hidden in Mr. Lytton's guest room this afternoon. I wanted to ensure no one else, especially Charlotte, found them before I could study them. I did not intend for Mr. Brent to die. He startled me, and he fell. And the placement in the alcove, it was meant to disguise the accident. I had no intention of murdering him." Miss Marple inclined her head. "An accident, yes. Yet it demonstrates the danger of secrecy and deception. The first death, however, Mr. Lytton, was deliberate, for he threatened to expose irregularities that could have affected your inheritance. That required forethought, planning, and manipulation of perception, all consistent with your behavior tonight." Felix crumpled into a chair, head in hands. "Yes," he admitted finally, voice barely audible. "It was me, but I never meant to hurt Brent, or anyone else." Inspector Graves nodded grimly, taking his cues. "You are under arrest, Mr. Harrow. You will be held accountable for your actions." Miss Marple stood back, observing quietly. The confession had resolved the puzzle, but she knew the undercurrents of fear and desire that had led to this point would linger among the villagers for some time. Charlotte, relieved yet shaken, sank into a chair, clutching her hands together. Miss Marple approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The truth has a way of emerging, my dear. People will act in ways that reveal it, if one is patient enough to notice." Charlotte nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. I understand, Miss Marple. Thank you. The colonel exhaled, leaning heavily on his cane. I cannot say I would have discovered any of this on my own. You have a remarkable gift, Miss Marple. She smiled softly. Only a matter of observation, Colonel, and the willingness to let people reveal themselves without interference. The inspector collected Felix and led him away. As the hall fell into a quiet, tentative calm, Miss Marple looked around at the assembled household. 2 lives had been lost, secrets unearthed, and a small community had glimpsed the dangerous consequences of hidden motives. Yet, despite it all, life at Larkspur Hall would continue, though now with a careful watch over the subtle intricacies of human behavior. Miss Marple settled back into her chair near the hearth, hands folded, reflecting quietly on the frailties, desires, and obsessions that drove people to acts they later regretted. And as the shadows lengthened across the polished floorboards, she sipped her tea calmly, knowing that in the stillness of observation, truth had once again triumphed. The case was closed, the mystery solved, and Larkspur Hall returned, at least outwardly, to its usual serene yet forever altered routine. The sharp observation of a quiet mind had once more unveiled the hidden patterns of human nature. Justice, subtle and precise, had been served.